following stories tell the tale of some of the most insane and terrifying female killers to ever exist. We have a woman who partnered with her husband to kill innocent girls, a nurse who killed babies for no reason, and yet another woman who killed 8 members of her own family. Stay tuned.
"25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester has become one of the most infamous addresses in Britain. For 20 years, Fred and Rose West quenched their appetite for sex and murder inside this house of unimaginable horror.
Rose West and her husband Fred are some of the most horrific people you could ever imagine. They got their kicks off of abusing and killing helpless girls. But what made them this way? How did they become so sickeningly evil and inhumane? Let's take a look back at the history of this couple and try to find out. This story starts getting pretty disturbing early on. It's the year 1969, and Fred West is 28 years old with a wife and a family of his own. But he secretly had his eyes set on a girl who was only 15 years old. Her name was Rose. Rose and her family had only recently moved to the area where Fred had been brought up. Fred was the oldest boy in his family, and he came from a history of very severe abuse at the hands of his own mother, who took advantage of him physically.
His mother abused him essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways.
So it's very clear that both of these individuals had very twisted childhoods. But what effect did that have on them growing up? Well, Fred decided to go on to pursue Rose despite her being just a minor at the time. They ended up meeting at a bus station, and though Rose admitted that Fred wasn't the best kept man there ever was, she was still attracted to him, and part of the attraction was that they both shared very similar pasts.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father.
And so Fred ended up moving in with Rose along with his own stepdaughter. Before long, they were pregnant with their first child, a girl named Heather.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
2 decades went by and the couple remained together. But then something shocking happened among their family.
Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing.
However, the police had been aware that there were some allegations that child abuse was occurring inside Rose and Fred's home, so they started an investigation looking into where Heather could be. One of Fred and Rose's children had told a friend at school about abuse that was occurring within the home, and that friend went and told the police officer. Before long, they had enough evidence to remove the 5 West children from the home. The rumor that was going around the neighborhood was that Fred had killed Heather and buried her beneath an outdoor patio. So many people talked about this theory that eventually the police began to wonder if there could be any truth to it.
Despite massive amounts of inquiry to try and find out, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
Could Heather really be buried beneath the patio? Not knowing where else to look, they decided to get a warrant to dig it up.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house, and they went into the back garden, and the officers started digging the garden. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist.
It was confirmed that, sure enough, the remains belonged to Heather. At the time that Heather's remains were located, Rose was at the police station being questioned. She seemed very shocked when she got the news.
At that time, I believe that she was shocked and distressed.
The police could have never expected that they would end up finding when they digged up that patio. There were more than just 2 leg bones under there. This meant that there was someone else under there, in addition to Heather. When they brought this up to Fred, he wasn't surprised.
Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that would be Shirley.
The more the police searched, the more they found. There were clearly many secrets that had been hidden at 25 Cromwell Street.
Fred told the investigating officers the other body was of his former lover, Shirley Robinson. West also admitted that police would find a third body in the garden. Throughout the questioning, he insisted on one thing, that his wife Rose knew nothing about any of the bodies.
But how is it possible that all of this could have been going on in the family home without Rose having a single clue? As police try to unravel what could have happened, it becomes clear that this is a very complicated and confusing case. To make things worse, Fred kept changing his story over and over again. He would go from denying the killings altogether to saying that they were accidental, likely in an attempt to get charged with manslaughter instead of murder.
It's very difficult when somebody's been buried for years to look at them in detail as a pathologist. You haven't got the skin, you haven't got the muscles, you haven't got the organs, the things that you'd see injury or disease in.
Because Fred's victims had been dead for so long, it would be nearly impossible to figure out how they had died. They also had a hard time identifying the third victim that was found buried in the yard.
By using dental records, experts identified the third victim as Alison Chambers, who was just 16 when she went missing in 1979.
There were markings on Alison that proved that she had been tortured and was the victim of intimate violence before her death. This added a lot to the case because it showed that Fred wasn't just a killer, he was incredibly cruel and made these murders incredibly horrific and painful. As more information about these horrible murders was gathered, it became less and less believable that Rose couldn't have known what was happening.
It would appear inconceivable that she wouldn't have had knowledge of this.
Police began to wonder if there could be more victims beyond the 3 bodies they had located so far. So they began to look into local missing person cases. This was an impossibly large search.
We were dealing with forensic materials, massive amounts of forensic material, searching. It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
Eventually, police were able to determine 2 missing women who stood out. One was 21-year-old student Lucy Partington. She went missing from a bus stop. The other was Linda Go, a 19-year-old who went missing the same year. Police found out that Fred and Rose actually worked together to lure their victims.
They would identify young women on the run, if you like. They were vulnerable. They would offer them a home.
Fred and Rose would specifically look for women that looked young, vulnerable, and a little lost. Working as a couple made things easier for them because people were more likely to trust Rose since she was a woman. They believed they would be safe with her.
Rose already knew the language of grooming. She was quite used to it. And when you hear the victims talk about how she spoke to them in this sort of quite soft, pleasing voice.
Police needed help in prosecuting Rose, and this help came in the form of a woman named Caroline Roberts. She contacted police and told them that in 1972, she had been physically violated by both Fred and Rose. They had picked her up while she had been hitchhiking. She also worked for them as a nanny for a little while.
They invited her back to the house. She was then bound and subject to some rather aggressive sexual activity. She managed to escape subsequently and reported it to her mum, who then told the police.
The pair were both arrested and charged with rape. At the time, Caroline had been too afraid to face them during the trial. Ultimately, Fred and Rose's charges were reduced and they were given a fine, but no prison time.
With the information Caroline gave to the police, they could link Rose to the crimes and bodies at Cromwell Street.
Police now knew that these killings were intimate in nature. Binds and gags were used on the victims, and Fred and Rose worked together to carry out the dangerous assault. Police believed that there could be a lot more hidden on the Cromwell Street house, and so they decided to move their investigation further into the house. On March 4th of 1994, their search led them down a dark cellar. It was there they located even more bodies. That same day, Fred handed over a handwritten note to police in which he made a startling admission.
I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approx 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified.
The admission brought the total victims up to a startling 10.
It's at that point the police realise that they are dealing with someone truly evil.
Police ended up taking Fred back to the house, where he helped them identify more of the bodies. All the while, he continued to say that Rose had nothing to do with the murders. It would turn out that the two of them had made a pact. Fred would take the blame for the murders, but she would stand by him and visit him in prison. They thought that one day, he might be a free man again. But things didn't go as Fred might have expected because Rose betrayed him.
But the minute Rose heard that he'd actually admitted to the murders, then she dropped him and she absolutely refused to have any contact with him.
The media presence at Fred and Rose's home was insane. The nation was absolutely shocked by the atrocity of these murders and wanted to know everything there was to know about this twisted couple. Police continued to recover more and more of Fred and Rose's victims, including Therese Sinelthaler, who was 21 years old at the time of her death. There were also remains of Shirley Hubbard, who was just 15.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
Police were still looking for Fred's wife, Rena West, who was last seen in 1971 at the age of 27. They asked for his help in identifying her, and he pointed them in the direction of a field near the West home. It was there that she was discovered. Meanwhile, slowly but surely, police continued to exhume more bodies in the Cromwell House cellar. Another victim was identified as Juanita Mott. Juanita was just 18 years old when she went missing in 1975. There was also Carol Ann Cooper, who was 15 years old when she went missing while walking back from the movies in 1973.
It's almost incomprehensible that two people could abduct young women or lure them to the house and subsequently, them and then kill them.
Eventually, police managed to recover the bodies of all 10 victims. It's very difficult to try to understand how this could have happened and why. Who would want to hurt innocent people in this way? It seemed to come down to the ways in which both Fred and Rose were raised and the abuse that they suffered. They had been hurt, and now they wanted to hurt others.
Everything he did was with Rose's help. And the thought of having some young woman hung up in the cellar, literally, almost defies belief. It is that horrifying.
Both Fred and Rose were jailed while awaiting trial, but the police needed more evidence if they wanted to truly prove that Rose took part in the murders. They wouldn't be able to get any more information out of Fred because he took his own life behind bars before ever even going to trial.
It seems almost appropriate that a man accused of taking so many people's lives should end up taking his own.
Fred's suicide threw a major wrench in the case. The police knew that they needed to get justice for the victims and their families, which included making sure that Rose would pay for her role in all of this. They couldn't mess this up. Still, many were really worried that the charges against her would be dropped. The trial against Rose caused such a media frenzy. It wasn't common for women to go to trial, much less to go to trial for the murders of 10 different people. Throughout the trial, she continued to claim her innocence, saying that it had been Fred behind all of this and that she had taken no part in it. But at the end of all of this, the prosecution was able to prove to the jury that Rose was truly guilty.
When the first guilty verdicts came back, Rose did not flicker, not a sign of emotion. And I was left with the overwhelming feeling that one had been in the presence of someone who had lost contact with humanity.
Rose was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finally, justice had been served. She remains behind bars and is now 69 years old. If you thought this story was crazy, wait till you hear the next story of yet another horrific female killer.
I trust you. and you would tell me, it's gonna be okay, Rosemary.
You should have to serve 1 year for every year of life you robbed from the babies that you murdered.
I often wonder how a person can sleep at night after taking so many helpless babies' lives.
We all want to know why, and I don't know if we ever will.
Janine Jones, who's known as the killer nurse, pleaded guilty to new murder charges this morning.
Paul Venema, who's been following the Jones case since her initial conviction in 1984, tells us what he's learned about a possible plea deal.
Who could possibly take the life of a newborn? Someone who has barely even had a taste of life yet. Even further, who could do it as many as 60 different times? The answer is Janine Jones, and she is known as the killer nurse, an American serial killer that strangely, many people haven't heard about. She would inject multiple different bad substances into babies to kill them.
Certainly was the most disturbing case I'd ever covered. How could you do something like this to an innocent child?
You took Muqadd's most precious gift, babies, defenseless, innocent.
Janine worked as a nurse in Texas during the 70s and 80s. To her patients, she seemed caring, compassionate, and charming. They were grateful for her care and attention, but staff at the hospital where she worked had their suspicions that there was a darker side to her. This is due to the sheer number of babies that were dying under her care. Something wasn't adding up.
Dr. Holland, who was a brand new pediatrician, just opened her practice, was in search of a nurse, and hired Janine Jones immediately for her pediatric clinic in Kerrville.
And in a period of 1 month, 8 kids had 9 separate emergencies and were rushed to the ER because they had stopped breathing. That was pretty hard to miss.
These babies were coming in for non-serious medical reasons. They could have been in for a routine checkup or for a cold. They might not have been showing any symptoms at all, only to end up dead with no explanation. They would simply stop breathing. One of Janine's victims was a 15-month-old infant named Chelsea McCland. When Chelsea began showing respiratory distress after being in Janine's care, the child was rushed to another doctor, who quickly noticed that the child seemed to be under the effect of a medication called succinylcholine.
Succinylcholine is a muscle paralytic that is usually used to paralyze someone's muscles for surgery or if they have to be intubated or something like that. If you were to inject it in a person, in a baby, it would just paralyze all of their muscles, including the diaphragm.
Without the ability to move the diaphragm, the person cannot breathe and will shortly die, which is what happened in Chelsea's case.
Inquiries are made in Dr. Holland's office, and they find out that, in fact, she did have succinylcholine in her office. It had been ordered by her nurse, Janine Jones. Upon inspection, Dr. Holland is saying that she has never prescribed it.
She checked her supply of succinylcholine and found that there had been a vial of succinylcholine missing. She asked Jones about it. She said, I don't know what happened to it. Just say we lost it.
The doctor went back to where the medicine was being kept, and sure enough, a bottle of this exact same medicine had recently been punctured. This had been done intentionally. But at the time that this occurred, there was not the types of testing and technology that are available today. There wasn't an easy way to detect for a fact that this substance was in Chelsea's body and led to her death. So instead, it was classified initially as sudden infant death syndrome. However, as time went on, they located a doctor who was able to test muscle tissue for the substance. So Chelsea's body was exhumed so it could be tested.
The first thing that I noticed immediately was the smell. And I know that's difficult to say, but that was my first experience with smelling decomposition.
The body was tested, and sure enough, this substance was found within her system. Now, finally, Janine Jones was charged with murder and injury to a child. The trial was incredibly disturbing and emotional, especially when Chelsea's mother took to the stand to describe the events that happened. It was said that every single person in the courtroom cried at the testimony, including the judge. But Janine shed no tears. In February of 1984, Janine was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 99 years behind bars.
Ronnie Sutton was the prosecutor out there in Kerrville. He said that the jury at the time said that if they could have given her the death penalty, they would have. They just couldn't.
Later that year, she was charged with killing yet another child, Rolando Santos, by using a different substance. She was given an additional 60 years behind bars. Today, we know that prior to her conviction, Janine claimed the lives of many, many other children. And in fact, she actually took a plea deal and pled guilty to another murder in 2020, that of Joshua Sawyer. Unfortunately, she was only ever convicted of 2 murders. Part of this is because hospitals where she worked destroyed their records to avoid getting into trouble. She is now 72 years old and will potentially be eligible for parole at the age of 87.
Finally, it is over. That is what the mother of one of the 5 infants that Janine Jones, known as the killer nurse, said following Jones's sentencing today.
As part of a plea agreement, Jones sentenced to life in prison.
The parents of the victims had a chance to address Janine in court.
I will leave you with this. I hope for you to live a long and miserable life behind bars.
She appeared stone-faced and unemotional as the sentencing took place. The family members of the victims were visibly distressed.
Nobody knows this pain I carry, only I. And finally it's over.
Some family members took comfort in the fact that even though Janine took their loved ones away from them, she will continue to live out her days in a cell.
Even though my brother is in a box, she's going to spend the rest of her life in a box too. So I can smile today knowing that.
If the story of Janine Jones shocked you, we have yet one more story of a sick female killer that is likely to do the same.
As an adult, Nannie Doss was eventually given the nickname the Giggling Grandma, a misnomer as this was a very dark and evil woman. She was also called by some media outlets Arsenic Annie, a far more accurate and concise nickname for this infamous serial killer. After her capture, Nannie Doss would later tell interviewers that her life was made up of an eternal search for, quote, the real romance of life. The price of this supposed eternal search would be in the form of the lives of Nannie's 4 husbands, of 2 of her children, of her 2 sisters, her mother, her nephew, and her infant grandson.
This is the story of someone who is the exact opposite of who you would want watching your kids. Nancy Hazel, who was called Nannie, was born in 1905 and had 3 sisters and a brother. She grew up working on the family farm instead of going to school. When she was 7, she suffered a head injury when she was riding on a train that came to a sudden stop. This resulted in her suffering from depression and frequent headaches later in life. She would later blame her future actions on this accident. Nannie was not allowed to attend social events or wear makeup as her father believed these things would lead her to be taken advantage of by men. She ended up getting married at just 16 years old to a man she hardly knew. The 2 had 4 daughters together but lost 2 of them to what was at the time suspected to be food poisoning. It was not a happy marriage, and the 2 would later separate. He would end up telling others that he left because he was afraid of his own wife. The pair would later divorce. Nannie's second marriage was to a man named Robert. They were married for 16 years until he died. It was later revealed that she had put rat poison in his whiskey after he had forced himself on her. She then collected his $500 life insurance policy. Melvina, one of Nannie's remaining children, gave birth to a son who also happened to be named Robert. Just 2 years later, she gave birth to another son. After giving birth, she was loopy and exhausted. She recalled watching her mother stick a hat pin into her newborn's head, but wasn't sure if what she had seen was real because she had been so tired at the time. Later on, Melvina and her mother were in a fight, but she left her son Robert in Nannie's care. Meanwhile, she went to visit with her father. When she returned, she would find out that the child had of asphyxia while in Nannie's care. Nannie didn't explain how Robert had died. You would think at this point, people would have surely had to have been getting suspicious of Nannie. After all, people were dying around her left and right. Something wasn't adding up. Unfortunately, if people were suspicious, they didn't notify the proper authorities. Nannie would end up marrying a third time, this time to a man named Arlie, who she met just 3 days prior. It was not a good relationship. He had a drinking problem and was gone for days on end. He ended up dying from what she said was at the time to be heart failure. Arlie had left the house he shared with Nannie to go to his sister's, but the home ended up burning down in a supposed accidental fire, and the insurance money was pocketed by Nannie. This was yet another suspicious occurrence in which a tragedy somehow ended up benefiting Nannie. But it didn't end there. Not long after that, her mother and sister both passed away from unknown causes. Single once more, Nannie was on the hunt for her fourth husband and met a man named Richard Morton. She probably hoped that this would finally be the loving relationship she was always hoping for, but it was anything but, and Richard ended up cheating on her. He then wound up dead after being poisoned at the hands of Nannie. In 1953, Nannie married a fifth time to a man named Samuel. But Samuel didn't share the same interests as her, and sure enough, he ended up poisoned as well. After his death, his suspicious doctor ordered for an autopsy to be completed on him, and it was discovered that his body was full of poison, arsenic. Nannie was soon after arrested. While in custody, Nannie confessed to the murders of her 4 former husbands, her mom, her sister, her grandson, and her mother-in-law. She was given life in prison. This was the default sentence at the time, as women were not eligible for the death penalty. She passed away while behind bars at the age of 60 in 1965. And so there we have it. 3 heartless female killers who took the lives of innocents. Who do you think of all of these was the most evil? Let us know in the comments.